Good morning, church. Today, Pastor Peter Chin will preach the message from Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 through 5. I'm Christina Clausen, and I will read in English.
And I am Kelly Brown, and I will read in Spanish. Hear the word of the Lord. No juzguen para que nadie los juzgue a ustedes, porque tal como juzguen se les juzgará, y con la medida que miden a otras se les midará a ustedes. ¿Por qué te fijas en la astilla que tiene tu hermano en el ojo y no le das importancia a la viga que está en el tuyo?
Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye?
¿Cómo puedes decirle a tu hermano, déjame sacarte la astilla del ojo, cuando ahí tienes una viga en el tuyo? Hipócrita, saca primero la viga de tu propio ojo, entonces verás con claridad para sacar la astilla del ojo de tu hermano.
How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. This is the word of the Lord.
You probably know we are starting a new sermon series which we're calling Upside Down, exploring the sermon that changed the world. And we're going to be looking at the Sermon on the Mount. And there's a couple of reasons we're going to be doing that. Number one, it is a really impactful sermon. It really did change kind of how people thought ethics and morality, especially from that time period. So it's really important for anyone to know ultimately, but especially for believers. The other reason why I think it's really good for us to go deep with the Sermon on the Mount is the time period we're in right now. That we're in an election season. We're hearing a lot about issues and about politics and about allegiances. And I think it's really good for us as believers to ground ourselves in who we are as Christians, who we are as Jesus followers. What do we believe? What do we do as Christians? And so I think as we go through the Sermon on the Mount, it's a counter-narrative to all the other narratives, all the other news and media that we're hearing. We're being reminded what it means to be Jesus' followers, because that's what the Sermon on the Mount does for us. And so I think it's really helpful for us to do that. I wanted to review what we talked about a couple of weeks ago in week 1. What I was kind of going through is my favorite part of the Bible, which is actually history. I love history and sociology. And what I was saying was, in Jesus' time period, there were a lot of groups that had a lot of influence when Jesus was around. And they had their own perspectives and kind of alignments. Some of them were pro-Roman, some of them were anti-Roman, some of them were pro-Greek, some of them were anti. So some of them were worshipped in Jerusalem, some of them worshipped outside of Jerusalem, believed in the afterlife, did not believe in the afterlife. And these are all groups that we find throughout the Gospels. And so when Jesus is coming into prominence, they're all watching him to see how is he going to align himself. Is he going to be pro-Roman? Is he going to be pro-Caesar? There was a joke that went around about him being pro-Caesar dressing. I think that was the joke was for some of us. And so all these different kind of people watching to see how he was going to come out. And so what Jesus does in the Sermon on the Mount is he makes his alignment and his perspective very clear. And he does that by mentioning this phrase over and over 15 times, and that is the phrase, Father in heaven. 15 times in the Sermon on the Mount, at least in the book of Matthew. Father in heaven, Father in heaven, Father in heaven. And through that, what he's doing to all of these groups, he's establishing his alignment, his perspective. And he's making it very clear. Do you want to know who I represent? Do you want to know what perspective I align with? I am here for the Father in heaven. I align with the Father in heaven. He's looking at issues through the lens of the Father. He's looking at people through that. He is pleasing the Father in heaven. Everything he's doing is for the Father in heaven. And so he makes that really clear in the Sermon on the Mount. And I think that's helpful for us as well, because we're hearing the same kind of temptations, the same kind of calls to align in one way or another with one political party or one candidate or whatever it might be. And I think the Sermon on the Mount is a reminder to us to align ourselves with the Father in heaven. That's who we represent. It's the vision, it's the value, it's the way we look at things. It's the voice that we're trying to use. It's the Father in heaven. And I think the Sermon on the Mount does a great job of reminding that of for us. Today, what I wanted to do is talk about something that I think is similar, and that is to kind of reestablish the point that the Sermon on the Mount is often viewed as an ethical or moral code, or more simply, what people should or should not do. I think most of the times when someone, let's say, who has no familiarity with the Bible or with church, they ask you, what is the Sermon on the Mount? An easy answer is we could say, it's kind of like an ethical code. It's Jesus' ethics. It's the morality of the kingdom of God. It's a very simple way for us to understand it. It's kind of what we should or should not be doing. And I think it's actually accurate. That's not an inaccurate thing to say. The Sermon on the Mount is kind of an instruction manual or an ethical code for us to follow as Jesus followers, as people of the kingdom of God. If that's true, though, we have to recognize is this. If the Sermon on the Mount is an ethical code, it is one that starts with looking in the mirror. That really is the first step of this ethical code, of the Sermon on the Mount. And we see it over and over throughout the Sermon on the Mount. For example, in today's passage in Matthew chapter 7, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. It's very clearly, in this teaching on the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is saying, look at yourself first. Don't look at the other person. Don't look at what they have in their eye. Look at your own eye first. And he says this several times throughout the Sermon on the Mount. For example, in Matthew chapter 5, when he talks about adultery, he says, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. Don't do that thing. Don't do that bad thing. But then he changes it and he says this, but I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. In this question of ethics, what you should or should not do, specifically in adultery, Jesus says, look at yourself. You want to know about adultery? Look at your heart. Look at where your eyes go. Look where your hands are. Then you're going to know adultery. He says the same thing when it comes to murder. He says, you want to know about murder? Then think about how you speak to a person. Think about your anger. Think about what's going on here first, then you understand murder. He calls us to look at ourselves. He even done this in action with other people, in a very famous example in John chapter 8. There's a woman who is caught in the act of adultery, and it says this, in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say, Jesus? They were using this as a question, as a trap, in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. And so again, this repeated command, this dynamic, that when you're thinking about ethics, you're thinking about adultery or murder or questioning someone, over and over Jesus says, look at yourself first. Look at your hands, look at your eyes, look at your heart. Look and see if you do anything similar. That is always the first step when it comes to the Sermon on the Mount. So according to the Sermon on the Mount, any question about ethics or morality should begin with introspection and self-awareness. An ethical code that begins with introspection. A moral standard that begins with us knowing ourselves first. And that was so different from the time that Jesus lived in because of the influence of the Pharisees. The Pharisees believed very much in morality and in ethical codes, but they externalized. It was always about watching other people and measuring what they were doing. In fact, they were famous for literally measuring things. And Jesus would say this in Matthew chapter 23. They would measure clothing to see how long tefillins were, or how long kind of braids were. They would measure the offering that people would give of spices that they gave to the temple. They were so externally focused. Is that person doing the right thing? Is Jesus doing the right thing? Is this leper doing the right thing? Always thinking about others. And Jesus says, don't think about others. Think about yourself. And this is a radically different understanding of morality than was just so dominant at that time for the influence of the Pharisees. Always thinking about other people and what they're doing wrong. He says, don't do that. Look first at yourself. I would go so far as to say this was not just radically different in Jesus' age, it's also radically different from our age. Because our age is also very externally focused when it comes to people's behavior. We as a culture, going beyond political kind of affiliations and allegiances, we are very focused on what is that person doing wrong? Did they post that on Facebook or on social media? What's their stance on this? Our culture as a whole has gotten to a space where we are just like the Pharisees. We are watching and measuring and seeing if people are saying the right thing. So believe it or not, there are a lot of parallels to what first century Pharisaic ethics were and where we are right now as a culture. We are constantly watching others or being watched by others to see what our moral standards are. And so I think Jesus' teaching here is so applicable to not just that time period, but to us today, that our first step should be looking at ourselves. Yeah. There are a lot of ways to do this, practically speaking. There are a lot of ways to be introspective, to be self-aware. I think sometimes just silence, to be honest, just being quiet, not having a response to everything right away, but just listening, being quick to listen is so important. I think just spending time confessing and reflecting is important. But I think the most practical way that we can look at ourselves is through the act of asking questions. Questions are reflections, right? They're helping us understand ourselves better. And so here are a few reflection questions that we can ask ourselves whenever we're thinking about what we should or should not be doing. One question is, do I really understand this situation? Do I really get this? Do I understand the ins and outs of it? Do I understand this person? Do I understand the biblical part of it? Do I understand the sociological parts of it? Do I get this for real? And even this would cause many of us to just stop and not say anything afterwards. I brought this up a few months ago when it came to all the violence that was happening in Israel and in Gaza. And I asked a question of myself and others, and that was this. When you heard about Gaza, did you have to look it up on a map to find out where it was? And how many of us honestly did not know where Gaza was? When we're really honest with ourselves. Only David McIntosh is brave enough to admit it. But I would also have to say that. As much as I know about that region, I went to seminary to learn these things, and I had to still go back and understand these things. And yet, how many of us in our culture are willing to spout off any kind of opinion with no knowledge whatsoever? No knowledge whatsoever. And so we have to understand that the first question we should be asking ourselves, do I really get this? Do I really know this situation? Do I really know this person? Do I really know what the truth is? It's a simple question. A second question we can ask ourselves, and we can go to the next slide, is this. Have I done something similar before? Have I done something similar that maybe I forget or I didn't think were? And this happens so often when we look at someone and think, oh, that's so bad. It's so bad that this really rich person would do that. How many of us are doing something very small in our own lives? We're not being free-handed with our resources. We think about one person's sexual sin and we think, oh, that's so terrible. I would never do that. And yet we lived years and years in sexual sin in our own lives. How often are we doing that? And we're thinking about the people around us. Another question we can ask is, am I really the right person to say anything? Am I the person to be doing this? Do I have the qualifications? Have I made any investment in this topic up to this point? Have I done anything when it comes to this topic? Or am I just going to jump in? Jump in with no kind of relational investment, never cared for this person, but I have an opinion about your life right now. A deeply personal one that might be offensive to you too. Right? We do that without asking that question. Or the fourth question. Is there something that I should be focused on in my own life first? Is there something a plank that I carry and everyone sees it, and yet here I am. Wow, look at all these specks all around me. Right? Just that simple question. Is there something that I should be taking care of before I say anything to anyone? It's a simple question, but I think what that does is that brings us into alignment with the Sermon on the Mount, with this basic fact about the Sermon on the Mount. If we really want to follow the Sermon on the Mount, then the first step is always look in the mirror. Look in the mirror. If we want to be people of the Sermon on the Mount, we want to be these these moral people who follow after Jesus, the very first thing we do is we ask questions of ourselves. And we look into ourselves and our own heart and our own motivations, because that's where the Sermon on the Mount begins as well. That teaching is really clear, and Jesus just hammers that over and over. Look at yourself. Don't be looking at other people before you look at yourself. But as clear as this dynamic is in the Sermon on the Mount, it's often misinterpreted because we take this call to looking at ourselves, introspection and self-awareness, and then other things kind of cascade out of it. Other assumptions, other beliefs or ideas kind of overflow out of this call to know ourselves. For example, one thing that we often think because we're called to look at ourselves is this. Looking in the mirror means that Christians shouldn't have moral convictions. And this is oftentimes, I think, the next step in this process. You know, we might hear me saying, hey, look at yourself, look at your own heart. And kind of we do that, and the natural assumption is, man, the world is so complicated, it's so complex, there is no right or wrong. It's all just morally gray. I can't figure it out because I looked into myself. And that is oftentimes the next step that we take in this progression. We say, I looked at myself, I don't get it. There's no right or wrong anymore, right? I can't figure it out. And so we think we shouldn't have any convictions. We shouldn't have any standards because all we're supposed to be doing is kind of navel gazing, right? We just spend so much time looking at ourselves, we actually don't have any convictions at the end of that process. That's oftentimes where I think our world is. We don't feel like we have any moral convictions. Another misinterpretation that comes out of the Sermon on the Mount is this. Looking in the mirror means that Christians should never express their moral convictions, right? We hear this, look at yourself, know yourself, and that's the end of the story. Just look at yourself. Don't talk to me about anything, right? That's the end of that story is just introspection. Just know yourself, and that's our whole moral process. It's just, again, we just look at our navels, we look at our belly buttons, and that's Christian standards. That's Christian practice. It's tempting as those two misinterpretations are, and I think we naturally kind of flow into them. Whenever we're thinking about ourselves, thinking about what we're doing, become silent, we become unsure of ourselves, and so I think this is very natural. It's not supported by the Sermon on the Mount, though, because in many places throughout the Sermon on the Mount, we read something like this in Matthew chapter 5. Jesus says, "For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." Jesus doesn't say, hey, there's no righteous, there's nothing righteous, you can't figure it out. He says, no, you need greater righteousness. You need greater righteousness. He says, you're not supposed to not have it. You still should understand what righteousness means. In today's passage, he says this, "You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, comma, not period." He doesn't say, just take care of yourself and don't talk to nobody. He says, take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. You still have an obligation to live out the standards that we know from God. We are not to be silent on these things. Even in that beautiful passage in John chapter 8, where Jesus is ministering to this woman who has been caught in adultery. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left, with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." He says that. He doesn't just say, just go now. We're all good. He gives instruction. He gives correction for her own sake. Because there's something damaging about the way that she's living her life, about her relationships to the people around her. And so he's pointing that out for her sake. But he points it out. Jesus' moral ethic is not, I'm not going to say anything to you. I'm just not going to condemn. I'm going to be silent in this situation. No, he does speak out. And so I think this is really important to point out. It is wrong to see the Sermon on the Mount's call to introspection as the absence of moral or ethical convictions. Yes, the Sermon on the Mount is saying, first look at yourself. Don't do anything before you know yourself and you know your sins and you know what you have done wrong. Absolutely. But then you do need to speak. You do need to be salt and light, which is also talked about in the Sermon on the Mount. This is tricky, though. This is tricky. How do we get called to look at ourselves deeply, to know ourselves deeply, but also to live out these things? What does introspection do for us? If it doesn't make us silent, if it doesn't make us morally ambiguous, then what is it supposed to do? I think what introspection can do is this. Introspection does not mean we have no moral convictions or should be silent about them, but it does change how we express them and live them out. That's really what it does. Introspection is not supposed to serve as the end point. It's not supposed to serve to silence us. It's not supposed to serve so that we don't have a conviction. It changes how we live them out. Let's go back for a moment and look at those questions, those introspective questions that we talked about earlier. Questions like, do I really get this? Do I really know what's going on? Am I really informed about this situation? Or is this just a hot take? This is just another hot take situation, right? Or a question like, have I done something like this before? You know, when this person sinned, have I done it at some other point in time? Or maybe I'm doing it in my own life right now. Am I the right person to be saying something? Have I invested in this topic, in this person in some way? Is there anything in my own life that I should be focusing on instead? These are introspective questions, right? They're questions we can ask ourselves to know ourselves better. But what they do also is they change the way that we speak to one another afterwards. They change the overflow, and they change how we live out our convictions. And they make us say things like this: you know, I am not at all perfect. I am not perfect. We can use these moments as a moment of humility to say, I'm no better than you. I'm really not. We can say things like, I have done the same thing before. Did you know that when you call someone out, it doesn't have to be a call out, it can actually be mutuality. It can be about confession together. You are confessing your sin to the person as you are trying to identify a sin in their life. Or if it's not something you struggle with, you can say, you know, you're going through that, but I have my own struggles. My own struggle is this. And then it's a very human moment, a moment for you to walk with this person. You can go on and say something like, you know, maybe this is something we can work on together. Maybe this is something that we, as two people, not just me calling you out, maybe you can help me with what I just confessed to you and what I'm identifying in your life instead. And it's different. Maybe the last thing we would say is nothing at all. And we recognize I am not that person, or there's too big of a plank in my own eye to do anything here, and so I'm not going to say anything when it comes down to it. But you see what those questions of introspection do? They're not supposed to silence us. They're not supposed to dilute our moral character and our moral calling. What they're supposed to do is to frame and to shape the way that we talk to other people and the way that we see them and the way we engage with them. Introspection and self-awareness ensures that our ethics are lived out with humanity, humility, and compassion. That's what these things do. They are not the end point for us just to look at ourselves, understand ourselves better. They transform us. So when we go to people and we live out and we proclaim that we are salt and light, we do so with a lot of humility. And they'll see our love and our humanity and our compassion as we do so. And I would say, honestly, in this moment that we find ourselves, in this fall of this election year, this is what our world desperately needs. People who have strong moral convictions, but live them out in humble and loving ways like Jesus did. And it's the practice of introspection that allows us to maintain that balance. The world doesn't need one or the other of these things. It doesn't need more people who have strong moral convictions but are such jerks about putting it out there. We have plenty of people who do that already. Our world is filled with people who know everything but have no idea how to love their fellow human being. We don't need more of that. We really, really don't need more of that. But that doesn't mean that we should just abandon our morality. We need people who believe things. We do need that at the same time. And the only way that we're able to balance these two things that our world need is through this practice of knowing ourselves. Knowing ourselves gives that humility, gives that self-awareness, so we can live out these things in humble and loving ways. And that's the worship team, if you guys want to make your way forward. I'm going to close in a second, but I want to give us a time just to think about these issues even right now, to spend some time in introspection. And what I want us to do is this. I want you to think about right now kind of one of those great moral issues of the day, right? And it doesn't take long for you to think about what those issues are. Yeah, go ahead and make your way up. Just think about one of the issues. It could be, political. It could be about, Gaza and Palestine, about same-sex marriage, about abortion, about any kind of issue that kind of is the one that you're always kind of wrestling with and thinking about. Just go ahead and think about it, right? And what I want us to do is apply exactly what we talked about today. Because Jesus says that when you hear these things, when you hear it's a question of adultery, a question of murder, a question of swearing, a question of anything, the very first thing you do, look at your heart. Don't think about that person. Don't think about the society. Don't think about that political candidate. Know yourself. And so I want us to ask that question of ourselves first. And those 4 questions are these. Do I really understand that situation? Do I really get it? The second is this. Am I doing something similar, or have I done it? Am I kind of tangentially or in some ways guilty of the same thing? Am I the person to say anything? Have I made any investment in this person or this situation? And is there anything in my own life that I should be focusing on instead? And then I want us to think about, how does that change how we engage? How does it change how we live this out? How does it change what we would say to a person and in situations? Why don't we take a moment to do that in prayer and reflection? Let's bow our heads and do that together. And just think about that question and how self-awareness, self-reflection changes how we engage with these kind of things. Let's just spend a moment in reflection together before I pray. Dear God, we all want to be people of the Sermon on the Mount. We know how important it was to you and to us, God. And many of us know so many of the amazing teachings that you put out in the Sermon on the Mount. But oftentimes we forget one, and that is to first look in the mirror. The one that you said over and over again in so many words, Lord. And we want to reclaim that. We want to align ourselves with the Sermon on the Mount. And before we hear and talk about the issue about murder, or about adultery, or about divorce, or about Gaza, about abortion, about all these different issues, instead of opening our mouth, we would close it. Instead of looking at the people around us, we would look into ourselves instead. Help us to do that today. But not so that we would believe nothing, not so that we would be silent, but so that that process of introspection and self-awareness would shape us. It would make us humble and human and compassionate in the same way that you were humble, human, and compassionate, God. So that as we engage and we try to be salt and light, that people would know that we looked into ourselves first, that we did spend this time looking in the mirror. Help us to do that, that we might be what this world needs, which are people who have moral convictions, people who have moral fiber, but at the same time deeply love our fellow human being in the way that the Father does. Help us do that more and more, God. Help us to look into ourselves that we might be more like you as we live in this world. We pray that in Jesus' name. Amen.